Welcome everyone to this panel discussion about the five hypotheses of Russian theory of second language acquisition. Between the decades of the 17th and 80s, the linguist Stephen Krashen was developing his studies of hypothesis of this theory of second language acquisition. These hypotheses are the input hypothesis, the acquisition hypothesis, the monitor hypothesis, the natural order hypothesis, and the affect filter hypothesis. Our goal will be to learn more about the five hypotheses of Russian theory of second language acquisition. And for this panel, we are joined by colleagues Keren Maradiaga, Keyrin Hernández, Katia Pérez, Lorena Ortiz, and me, Sonia Sauceda. To start, I would like to ask our experts, what is the second language acquisition?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to participate with you in this panel. My name is Keren, and I will start by talking to you a little about the acquisition of a second language. First of all, you have to know the definition, and well, the acquisition of a second language is a learning a second language after a first language. It's already established many times, and this happens when a child who speaks a language other than English goes to a school for the first time. Children have an easier time learning a second language, but anyone can do it any age. It takes a lot of practice. However, what is the best way to teach a second language? There are several factors that can intervene when and we are teaching a second language. For example, when we teach a second language from home and we are constantly speaking the person to whom we are teaching, it is receiving an opportunity in which he practices the language more. And thanks to this, people manage to obtain an internal motivation to keep learning it and not give up learning a language so easily.
Good afternoon, everybody. And I am Lorena. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And what I quite like what Keren comment. And for the same reason, I would like to intervene with my opinion. I would like to say that it's important to know when we are learning a new languages. I think it's important that we have to connect with that languages. For example, we have to connect with its history, its regionalism, its culture, etc. Because if we do this, and the person will feel that like he's nurturing his brain with relevant information. This is really important when we are acquiring skills such as listening and speaking, and I think this helps us to have greater concentration and more critical thinking.
Hello, everyone. My name is Katie Hernández, and I really agree with what Lorena mentioned. And regarding what she was talking about, I would like to mention that there are different ways to introduce a second language. The first, a very good example with the environment. For example, the child learns the second language at school, but speaks his native language at home. And this so that he's related to both languages, but in different environments, so that the person who learns it know when to speak it and of course not get confused. Second, I also consider it important that in many cases, for example, the mother speaks English and the father speaks Spanish. In these cases, the child can speak only English with the mother and only Spanish with the father. An equally satisfactory result will always be seen that he will know the moment in the person with whom he should speak certain language. The third, the ability of a person to use a second language will depend on her family's ability to speak more than one language. It is important for parent caregivers to provide a strong language model. If you cannot use the language well, you should not be teaching it.
Hello everyone, my name is Katia Pérez and I would like to comment on what Keyrin said. Everything you said is true. There are definitely several ways to introduce the acquisition of a second language. But I would like to clarify that acquisition a language is not the same as learning it, since the language acquisition is acquiring a language, is simply knowing the words. Since the language is not something that is taught children, and a child will learn her mother tongue simply by being around other people, mainly her families. This is called language acquisition. While language learning is teaching the language itself, this is the process that most people go through when trying to learn another language. Here, the student is made to study vocabulary lists as well as sentence structure and grammar. This is the most common method used in schools and language learning centers.
Well, girls, it really seems to me that everything you have said is very correct. Both the factors and the ways in which a language can intervene. So now I'd like us all to talk about the stages of second language acquisition. When a child is acquiring a second language, he goes throughout some stages. Okay, the first stage is called silent stage. This stage can last from several hours to several months, depending on each study. Therefore, generally say how long this period is almost impossible because it depends on many personal and individual variables that come into play. Here, the student is not producing a language as such, but she is very actively processing it. The silent period has been used in language teaching methods such as total physical response, the natural approach, and automatic language growth.
Okay, I don't really agree with what Sonia mentions. Since, for example, the stage of silence will say that it depends more on the environment that surrounds it than on the student itself. I have an example. If the student listens to the language 6 hours a day in a bilingual school, his period of silence will be less. But if he only listen to the language 2 hours a week, his period of silence will be greater, and this is because it takes longer to understand the language and to put knowledge into practice.
Well, I would like to comment on something that Keren said. It's important to know that in this stage, the child doesn't know, speaks the language with fluency or real understanding. This stage can last from several hours or months, depending on each student. But once they start, they learn according to their ability and the support we give them. But the period of silence occurs at all age.
What Lorena mentions is true. In these stages are very important for the acquisition of a second language. The first stage I want to mention is early production. This stage may last about 6 months. In this stage, the child begins forming short phrases, even though they may not be grammatically correct. For example, my name Valentina, I like play, but the person who listens to them can perfectly understand what they want to tell us. Um, there is also the third stage, which is speech emergence. Students in this stage begin to respond in simple sentence when they are comfortable in the setting and engage in activities they understand. All interactions with the student in this stage should be focused on communication rather than form.
I would like to intervene in this topic. Also, I'm thinking about the stages of the acquisition of the second language. I do not want us to forget the stages of the intermediate fluency, since students in the stages gradually make the transition to more elaborate speech. With continued comprehensible input and communication focus interactions, students maybe to link familiar phrases and generate a sentence to express their ideas. The teacher needs to provide frequent opportunities for students to produce language in comfortable situations. And this is where one of my favorite stages come in, which is continue languages, develop advances and fluency. According to the studies, it takes most learners at least 2 years to reach these stages, and then up to 10 years to achieve a full mastery of the second language in all its complexity and nuances. It is appropriate to be to direct students' attention to the grammar, idiomatic expression, and reading comprehension skill, the key to learning a new languages and developing proficiency and speaking and writing that languages is consistency and practices.
Thanks, Katia. And I want to share an anecdote about my niece. I saw these 5 stages reflect in my niece when she was learning English. I remember that when she learned certain words, she repeats them all day, and sometimes she said incomplete sentences, but I could perfectly understand them. As she progressed, her English improved. That's why I remember this anecdote, because I could see my niece process reflecting these stages.
I think this is normal when you are a child at first, then they do not speak correctly, but you always understand what they mean.
Well, the explanation that you all girls have given has been very helpful to better understand the subject. And now I would like to talk a little about the acquisition learning hypothesis and the monitor hypothesis. But first, we need to know who Stephen Krashen is. Stephen Krashen, he was born in 1941, and he's an expert in the field of linguistics. He has especially in theories on the acquisition and development of bilingual and non-English languages. He also believes that the humans being have an innate ability that guides the language learning process. Krashen's theory of the second language acquisitions consists of 5 main hypotheses. The first, the acquisition learning hypothesis, and the number two, the monitor hypothesis. The number three, the input hypothesis, and number four, the affective filter hypothesis, and the number five, the natural order hypothesis. I would like to know which of you would like to start explaining any.
Okay, I will talk about acquisition learning hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, the humans have two systems to help them learning a new languages. The systems are the acquired system and the learn system. On the one hand, acquisition is a subconscious process in which the learner develops language skill naturally as they are not aware of the knowledge that they are acquiring. Moreover, in this acquisition of meaningful communication in the second languages, the system is necessary because it focuses on the act of communicating rather than of the correctness of the languages. In other words, during acquisition, the learner is not aware of the correct way of speaking, but is only learning to communicate.
Completing what Lorena said, now I will explain in simple terms what the second hypothesis consists of, which is the monitor hypothesis. The monitor hypothesis explains the relationship between acquisition and learning and define the influence of the latter on the form. The monitoring function is the practical result of the learned grammar. According to Krashen, and the acquisition system is the utterance initiator, while the learning system performs the role of the monitor. Of the editor, the monitor acts in a plain editing and a correcting function when three specific conditions are met. The number one is the acquired learner must know the rule. This is very difficult condition to meet because it means that the speaker must have had explicit instruction on the language form that she or he is trying to produce. The number two is the acquired must be focused on correctness. He or she must be thinking about form, and it is difficult to focus on meaning and form at the same time. The number three is acquired learner must have time to use the monitor. Using the monitor requires the speaker to slow down and focus on form.
Okay, what Katia says is really very interesting. I would like to further exemplify that topic by talking about the fact the monitor hypothesis and has three types of users. The number one is monitor over users. These language learners are too concerned and focus on correctness that they can speak with any real fluency. The second one is the monitor under users, and these language learners are not focused on correctness because they have not consciously learned the roles, or because they have decided not to use their concession knowledge on the target language. The third is the optimal monitor users, and these language learners are able to keep a balance between self-correction and influences, so error connection is not an obstacle in their quest of communication. These learners use their knowledge appropriately. An example of this will be an extroverted students who are under users, and while introverted students are perfectionists, are over users. Also, lack of self-confidence is often related to overuse of the monitor.
Yes, you have a reason, Keren. In my opinion, I think that many times lack of self-confidence is a factor that affects many students doesn't allow them to advance in think it is like a barrier. So, as not look hiring for the topic we are talking about, I want to continue discussing Krashen fight hypothesis. And I must say that is hypothesis 3 is very striking to me because the input hypothesis is a hypothesis in second language acquisition developed by Stephen Krashen, which states that a language learner gains the most benefit from receiving linguistic input that is just beyond his or her current in their language or level or grammatical understanding. This type of input is known as comprehensible input or I plus one, where I refers to the learners in their language. According to Krashen, comprehensible input is most likely to be gained from interacting with another speaker of the second language.
I think in some respect, the input hypothesis is fairly intuitive. Someone who understands only a few basic phrases of Chinese will not derive much benefits from listening to scientific discourse in Chinese, and it will be comprehensible. Likewise, someone who is nearly fluent in Italian will not gain much grammatical knowledge from a child's picture book because it will not introduce any new grammatical feature.
Of course, there, but do you know something? Krashen, however, draws on more complex theories of second language acquisition to make his claim. The interlanguage hypothesis states that learner acquires the grammatical features of a language in a predictable order, and that at any given time the learner has an internally consistent grammatical framework known as the interlanguage. As the learner progress, the interlanguage becomes increasingly similar to the target language's actual grammar. The input hypothesis states that input one stage closer to the target language, or I plus one input, helps the learner acquire the next set of grammatical features. It's not enough, however, for a learner to receive comprehensible input passively. He or she must then analyze the new data in order to move the interlanguage forward.
I was analyzing a lot about what you were talking about, and I was remembering that the input hypothesis states that the best way for learners to gather comprehensible input is throughout a sort of trial and error process of communication. The learner seeks out conversation partners who modify their speech until it becomes comprehensible to the learner. This process can be aided by nonverbal communication, such as by gestures, and by feedback can be from the learner when the process is successful. The learner's interlanguage grows to accommodate new grammatical features that he or she has observed.
Everything that you have mentioned, you are quite right, but I think I have a point against it. Seems Krashen claims that output or speech production has little to not relevance in second language acquisition. Many other research have criticized this position, however, saying that more advanced language learning and syntactic processing have to come through the trial and error process, not only of comprehending but also of speaking language. Output allows the speaker to test out his or her grammatical hypothesis and modify them. Its communication is not successful.
Well, I would like to add an anecdote that I have in mind. And I remember I was taking an English course a few years ago, and I have a classmate, and she told us in class that in order to have acquired her second language, um, which was Italian, she was exposed to a target language that was above hers, and also the level of competition she had at the time, and that helped her a lot.
I think it is a good practice to find a person who has a higher level of proficiency and who has a target language above yours to acquire a second language.
Okay, now who can explain to me about the affect filter hypothesis and the nature order hypothesis?
Okay, Sonia. In the first place, we have affective filter hypothesis. Sorry, hypothesis. This hypothesis is related to our interpersonal intelligence. Krashen tell us that we have to keep these variables in mind: motivation, self-confidence, anxiety, and personal traits. And he tell us in his theory that if we know how to keep these variables under our control.
Okay. I do not agree with everything you said, since the acquisition of a second language should not present any inconvenience for us. For example, a high motivation, self-confidence, a good image about ourselves, low level of anxiety, and extroverted personality will give us much success in the acquisition of a second language, while a low self-confidence, high levels of anxiety, and a bad image of ourselves and introversion will create a block in our minds, and that will make it difficult for us to learn.
In my opinion, it seems very interesting, but at the same time, factors like these are not easy to manage in the students. Many, even some, come with us in genetics. So I can say that there is a social and genetic factor in that theory that makes more complicated to debate than others.
Well, girls, I can give myself as example. Well, I had always been a very introverted person, but I think that this was not a problem for me because I could say that in French, Italian, Japanese, or English, I have had very good results. But the problem is when I try to speak with fluency. I think that I need more self-confidence and I get overwhelmed by nervous and insecurities.
Well, girls, everything you have said has been very enriching. And to continue increasing of knowledge, I remind you of the last hypothesis, that is natural order hypothesis.
Yes, in that hypothesis, Krashen tells us that when we learn a language, whether it is the first or at the second, we usually have in order in which the grammatical rules are learned in a different order or difficulty. For example, learners acquire the grammatical morpheme ing before the morpheme third person s.
What Keren mentioned is true in a real life case. We can observe this as children when they learn to speak another language. At the beginning, they generally don't want to complicate themselves with grammatical rules and prefer to speak in the easiest way for them. And even if they are correct, they will continue to look for the easiest way to express themselves.
Well, thank you, girl, for having participated very actively in this panel. And I'm very satisfied with all the arguments that you offer in this meeting. But the points of and against have been very enriching for our learning. And in conclusion, Krashen summarizes his 5 hypotheses under one claim. People acquire a second language when they obtain comprehensible input and with their affective filters are low enough to allow the input in. And thank you again to our panelists for their very valuable input.